and I'll be moderating this panel discussion. As we sit here and discuss northern part of India, somewhere tiger numbers are being counted. I'm imagining a few rooms full of interns and researchers looking at their computers. Soon in April, India is going to release their tiger numbers. And I wouldn't be surprised if numbers for Central India increase again. They've been increasing for the last few times. Well, tigers are just one species, and we count them, so we have some idea about the numbers. But there are several other species that use areas outside protected areas in Central India. There are also elephants coming in from the eastern side of the landscape into the central part. And both of these things, animals being outside protected area, animal numbers increasing, animal fragmentation impacting animal species, has implications for both connectivity and coexistence. And that's what we're going to discuss today with a fantastic panel here with us today. We have Dr. Tabor, who is one of the founder members of the Yellowstone to Yukon Y2Y initiative, and also a founder of the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. We have Upasana Ganguly, who you must have all seen the Rite of Passage report. She leads the elephant connectivity work at Wildlife Trust of India. We have Ravi, who is the CEO at Metastring Foundation and also coordinator for the Biodiversity Collective that we heard about in the morning. Collaborative. Just heard about it in the morning, but yeah, Biodiversity Collaborative. And we have Kishor, who is the founder of the Satpuda Foundation and a secretary, honorary secretary at the NCCI currently. So we will ask each one of them a question, and after the responses, we will open it up for discussion, followed by another lightning round at the end. So let's start with Upasana. Upasana, could you give us an overview of why is connectivity important for species persistence in the future?
Thank you, Prachi. Good evening, everyone. So my work has primarily been on elephant corridors and connectivity. I have not worked really on tiger connectivity, except for the fact that there are quite a few elephant corridors which also facilitate tiger movement. I just thought that I'll set up the context here on what connectivity is, and like Prachi asked me why it's crucial for wildlife species to persist. Connectivity is essentially, like we know, is the degree to which a landscape can facilitate or impede movement of wildlife species. And wildlife corridors, they form an integral component of this connectivity to facilitate that movement. I think there is enough evidence, scientific evidence, to suggest that connectivity is essential for the long-term viability of wildlife. We all know that it's important for ensuring gene flow and in terms of resource access for wildlife when there is multi-generational range shifts and dispersal events. So I think those that much science is already available with us. And if we talk about the context in India, wildlife is getting pushed into smaller pockets day by day. Now, I was just reading somewhere that I think we have close to 900 to 1,000 protected areas in India now, and with the highest protected area somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 square kilometers. So in India we don't have the fortune of having protected areas like they do in Africa, which is close to 20,000 square kilometers. So we have several small protected areas which are very crucial for wildlife to harbor. But over the years, we have realized that these several small in isolation, they don't make sense unless they are connected. Because for wildlife to move, especially if I talk about elephants, they are peripatetic, they are nomadic. They need to move from one habitat to another. Once they move, the forest behind them regenerates. And since elephants are big, so they eat a certain amount of food they need. So they move, they have to move to allow the forest to grow, to allow the food to come up. So wildlife, they need to move. So now the question is, when they move, and that's where the connectivity, coexistence, dynamics come into play. So while we established that all this connectivity is important to maintain those ecological processes for any wildlife, and of course, even connectivity that's affected by the structural modifications which happen in the landscape, the anthropogenic barriers which the wildlife face, but also there are certain socio-ecological and psychological dynamics of people, their attitude towards the wildlife when they move through these connected spaces, which affects their connectivity, which affects or impedes rather their connectivity. So that's where the question of coexistence comes, whether we can get our human population to allow these wildlife, these wild animals to move from point A to B without disturbing or harming them, or without letting them come into human settlements, which is not possible because a lot of these landscapes are mosaic landscapes overlapping with human dominated landscapes. So I'm sure we'll have, in the course of the discussion, we'll talk about the challenges connectivity has and the approaches which one can take. But I just thought of setting the context that corridor or connectivity conservation for that matter and conflict mitigation are seemingly at odds with each other. So if you facilitate connectivity, of course, there'll be movement through human spaces, and then there'll be conflict, and then there'll be retaliation, which further impedes connectivity. So it's all a cycle. So I just thought of laying the context.
Thanks, Upasana, for setting that context. And we'll come to coexistence and the conflict that you spoke about. But before that, I want to ask one more connectivity-related question to you, Gary. The Convention on Biodiversity was recently held in Montreal, and countries have committed to a post-2020 biodiversity framework. There are a few connectivity updates in that, those commitments, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on those.
Yes, so in Montreal, the world, 192 countries came together and have decided that 2030 is our date. So from now till 2030 is our date to change the trajectory of how we are dealing or saving nature on the planet, and in a sense, how we are dealing and saving ourselves. Of the world's land-based, sea-based is to be protected and connected. It is risen as the well-connected. Usually, I'm the chair of IUCN's Connectivity Specialist Group, and I usually go, well, I'm the group that has to deal with the well-connected. But we don't know what well-connected is. It's a nice phrase. But what we're trying to do with connectivity conservation is to refine, define, and improve the practice of connectivity conservation. So it's not just, we're just good friends, but actually we're actually making a difference in having more effective conservation. Because protected areas alone, if we do increase to 30%, every nation in the world is committed to some degree to do this. If we just create more protected areas and they're not connected, we're not creating effective parks. And if anything we've seen is that by having all these protected areas, and we've increased the number of protected areas, but we still haven't changed the nature or the loss of biodiversity. And we have to change that trajectory because we haven't focused on how effective our parks are. And we know that connection is important. So one, in the new global biodiversity framework, now it says that we have to pay more attention to connectivity. It also says that in restoration, that the world now has a global target to increase restoration to 30% as well. And that includes connectivity. So our kind of textbook understanding of connectivity has been we have corridor areas connected through a corridor to another core area, and that's how we build a protected area network. But also the restoration community is having, well, we have to scale up restoration. Why can't the same concept of connectivity be applied to restoration, where you have restoration efforts in different parts of a landscape or seascape, and now you create some kind of connective function between these restoration efforts so that you can go to scale. Because going to 30% of restoration around the world can't be done piecemeal. It has to be done in a connected fashion. So that's the second aspect of connectivity in the global biodiversity framework. The third is that there's now an emphasis on spatial planning. The first goal, or the first target of the Global Biodiversity Framework is that all nation states should conduct spatial planning. Well, if you do spatial planning, then you have to realize that you're going to have to look at the connectivity of the landscapes or seascapes that you care about and prioritize the importance of those areas. So now it's embodied that all national biodiversity plans are going to be informed by spatial planning that will have connectivity as part of that work. And then finally, the fourth area where connectivity is now very visible is that areas that are both in green spaces and blue spaces, areas that are in cities and highly dense parts of the world, and so India covers 2 of those, have to increase their connectivity so that there's more access to nature, but also the fact that cities and highly dense areas are also part of landscapes. We've had this thinking that only nature is found in the most wild areas, but we know this. Conservation happens on all lands and waters. Parks are a key element of that, but they can't do it alone. And unless we think of parks being supported by conservation outside of parks, and connectivity is a very important value to that, then we enhance conservation across the entire landscapes and seascapes. And it all has to happen in the next 7 years.
Thank you, Gary. Kishor, I want to ask you, the 4 different areas where connectivity is a part of the commitments, how do these global commitments get translated at a very local level? How does it impact when you work outside predicted areas with the committees on connectivity, on coexistence? What are the steps and how does it impact?
See, if you look at our past experience of satisfying with the global commitments, it will definitely give you the better answer that how we respond to the global commitments. Previous government had already committed that we will achieve certain targets by 2020. The government got changed and they said, no, we cannot achieve it by 2020, we'll do it by 2030. So that's how, that's at the global level. But let us take our own National Wildlife Action Plan, the previous one, which had stated that we will have 10% of geographical area under PNA, which we could not fulfill. Now, if we have federal system, we have the states which are very powerful, running by different political parties, and as Dr. Ranjit Singh has already told in the morning, how India works and why there was a need to bring this special act, etc. So unless you have centrally sponsored scheme, states even won't listen to the federal government. So looking at all these issues, whatever action plans, etc. are already made, like we have already prepared the state wildlife action plan where we have already addressed all these issues, including linear infrastructure. They are already written in the state wildlife action plan. The most critical part or important thing is how you are going to transform these things into action. So if you want to have 10% protected areas, so you need to still identify some wildlife potential areas in the wildlife corridors and the connectivity maps that you have prepared. You need to find out those areas, declare them some protected area, maybe community reserve, start with the community reserve, upgrade them into maybe then conservation reserve, and then upgrade those conservation reserve into sanctuaries and national forests. Or even if you don't declare them protected areas, still there are mechanisms in place where you can provide community protection to the areas. So there are different ways of protecting, giving protection to the areas. But the real issue is how are we going to make it possible? So ultimately we need to more rely upon the Gram Sabhas, the village development plans, then if you talk about the NCCI, then they will believe in TCP. TCP itself says, ask the field director to mention about the corridors, and then the conservation mechanism or the strategy, how to deal with the different infrastructure agencies and infrastructure projects. So we have different set of mechanisms where we can address these issues. So I would rely more upon the village level and then the district level planning processes where we can definitely insert this. And there are some classic examples where individual matters. And there are individual politicians which understand this language, which understand the global commitments, and there are young politicians also. So we need to work with them and we need to better engage them in this planning process and get notifications issued, then later on implement some things and even conceive some schemes, better schemes like the Dr. Shama Prasad Janvan Mukherjee Yojana, which Maharashtra government has brought. Madhya Pradesh, there is no such scheme for the corridor. This is excellent scheme which deals with the community development and sustainable livelihood, alternate livelihood options for the community in the corridor area. So we need to bring such kind of schemes which will definitely help us in achieving these global commitments, rather than just believing that government of India will do something and they would do some allotment in the budget and then things would happen. I think we need to go ahead.
Thank you, Kishor. And it would also be really nice to hear more about area can be notified, corridors, or commitment 30 by 30. All of that may not always ensure coexistence. And I wanted to ask, are there any policy gaps that we can address in order to ensure coexistence while we increase area, do notification, think of future challenges to connectivity and so on?
Well, that's a very big picture question. As if it's something new. Before, I would say the last century at best, or even 50, 60 years, at the rate at which we've been disrupting natural movement of animals, there was no need for corridors because animals knew how to get around. Corridors are an artifact of our disruption of nature. So we are not doing nature a favor by creating corridors, but accepting our mistakes, hopefully, and then acting with better sense. So our thinking of corridors, I think, needs to change. Till very recently, and maybe even now, most people, even in forest departments, think of corridors like a civil engineering project, and often it's confused with corridors and buildings. They need to be straight and all that kind of stuff. And this is real. I'm not trying to point fingers at anybody, but this is prevailing reality in how conservation is thought of, planned, and implemented. And if that fundamental issue itself is not understood, whatever policy you create is not going to change the scenario. The second issue is, what is our understanding of what a policy is and what is it supposed to do? My limited understanding of policy is it is a statement of intent. In a world where rule of law is given the go by, when Supreme Court judgments are not acted upon, what is going to be the value of a policy? Existing laws are not implemented. Existing orders of the Supreme Court are not implemented. It is all fancy to say a policy is going to revolutionize the way this country or the world is going to function. So I think we all need a strong dose of a reality check. If we don't stand up for rule of law, do not expect some revolutionary action on the policy front. I'm sorry if I'm sounding pessimistic, but this is my lived experience. Which is not to say, I draw a lot of inspiration from what Gary just now said, but with a pinch of salt, because we did not achieve a single of the 18 targets. So what is the guarantee in a world which is riven with far greater levels of conflict, with increasing population, with increasing destruction or power of destruction of nature, that by 2030, we are suddenly going to turn out to be good boys and girls. Where is the confidence coming from? Unless we rethink basic concepts, ideas of what is development, what is a good life, what is human well-being, or even what is conservation, I don't think anything fundamentally is going to change. And I don't think we are even talking about it. Now, to try and be more grounded and try and answer your question, sorry for the preamble. You are talking of coexistence. You have very strong, deeply entrenched forest departments, conservation institutions, which go to court against a law which empowers local communities. And I'm talking about the Forest Rights Act. You can't have it both ways. You can't go to court against the Forest Rights Act and then ask the people to coexist with wildlife. The fact of the matter is, whether you call it coexistence or tolerance, millions of Indians are on a daily basis living with wildlife. More than 50% of our lions are outside game. On an average, 50 to 60% of our leopards are outside protected areas. 50 to 60% of our snow leopards are outside protected areas. Elephants, hundreds of elephants are moving on a daily basis outside our protected areas. Tiger, I think, is in the region of 30 to 40% outside your tiger reserves at least, and probably even outside your protected areas. So, neither does the wildlife have a choice, nor do the people have a choice. There is a reasonably uneasy truce prevailing over there. People in general realize through most of India that you can't go and kill wildlife. Health, education, nutrition, livelihoods. And if we can plan that without further disrupting wildlife habitat, I think that is the way to go. I don't know whether I answered your question, but that's where I am.
We are talking of wildlife, which is I think much later. If the soil and all these connections are not there, then how can the wildlife move? Another thing I am seeing since morning, we are always telling the community, but what about us? What about mining? What about industries? What about highways which take us to this Kanha National Park? There is one highway running right through the Kanha National Park. So are these not disruptions? Why should always the village people and the forest dwellers take the onus of saving or conserving the wildlife? What about the rest of us? I think probably we need to look into those perspectives.
It has already drawn attention on the encroachments, agricultural encroachments. So, lot of areas, and if you, I would just give one example of Maharashtra state. From 2007 to 2012, means when you said that tree cutting is bad for, if it is bad for constructing highways or railways, it is also bad for agricultural encroachments. You cannot say this is acceptable, this is not acceptable. Both is dangerous. And if you look at the statistics, I would give you statistics for Maharashtra. During 2007 to 2012, some 6,000 hectares was de-reserved for developmental infrastructure projects. Whereas 96,000 hectares was distributed, forest land distributed for IFRs, individual forest lands. So, we must be very clear. If something is wrong for infrastructure projects, it is also wrong for. So, whatever creates fragmentation, whatever creates.
Thank you. Yeah, and a lot of these issues are also implementation related issues of the Forest Rights Act. So we can discuss this further later if you have a question.
What's the alternate to the civil engineering? What's the alternate analogy? Is it a urban planners analogy? Won't that also be civil works? What's the alternate? What's the solution if it's not that? And this can, Ravi, you can both, but Gary also, you can.
I think spatial planning and landscape level conservation are the answers. The more inward looking we are with respect to PAs, the less successful we are going to be at the landscape level conservation.
So there's a lot of education that goes on with connectivity, especially in the policy environment.
Because of course there is always that lucrative idea of more money coming in and more development coming in. But if you somehow curate your interventions in a way where you can show the negatives of that, I think that can be one of the approaches. Could be different tools through awareness or through more participatory, actions where they see that okay, there is some benefit to wildlife as well as to us for our well-being, for our sustenance. So I think that is something which we need to look at while planning any interventions.
Gary, do you want to add the bit on participatory island with local communities that we talked about?
Yeah, so what we do is, sorry.
No.
So, interestingly, certain communities which I have worked with, especially in the Northeast, they have a very unique system of land management, resource management. So, they know that forests are important for them. So, every year, so it's a very tight-knit community in certain areas, and they don't have land as private ownership. What they have is like a community ownership. These are community lands. So, every year, they have an annual meeting where the village head allocates resources to each of the families in a village. That you can only cultivate in certain hectares every year, and you should leave this much forest. So in certain countries, of course, it's easier to leverage on that and use that. So when I say participatory, a lot of these interventions, what we've been trying to implement is motivate them to set aside land, and these are aligned with where the connectivity and corridors are there, in the form of villages of forest or community conserved areas. And in return, they are part of certain activities which we do, whether it's additional livelihood. I wouldn't call it alternate livelihood because the idea is not to change their livelihoods completely. We can think of some additional livelihood so that the dependency on the forests is reduced to some extent. And also exposure towards experience sharing. We have employed a lot of these younger generation as village reserve watchers. So they are paid to protect the forest, to monitor the forest, to collect information. So I think these are some ways of participation which we can think of from the community.
And this gives us hope, and that's why people are talking more about connectivity. Unfortunately, policymakers think of connectivity of corridors. That's where this engineering term comes in. They don't think of it in permeability. Ecologists will think of this as permeability, but try to sell permeability to a local community. It seems to like it's another mobile phone problem. They think of permeability as like it didn't come out in the wash. We're dealing with the lands that we've already fragmented, and we're trying to save the little bits left. And so we're stuck with that. However, those bits are the seeds for the future. So, in our way of looking at landscape planning, we look at these areas of connectivity not because these are the only places where nature can exist between protected areas or between restored areas, is that these are the places where nature can rebound, that they can grow from, so that we can have more integrity within a landscape.